If you dare to explore the darkest mysteries, subscribe now to Whispers in the Dark. Activate notifications and be prepared to hear whispers that may haunt you even in the silence of the night. Real stories, mysterious events, and spine-chilling tales. But beware, fear will always be your companion here. Click the subscribe button before it's too late. The Parking Lot Stalker. I don't know if I'll ever shake this feeling, but every time I step into a parking lot now, my heart races like I'm being hunted all over again. It happened last Thursday after work, around 8:30 p.m. I had stayed late because of a last-minute project, so by the time I left, the office lot was nearly deserted. The streetlights cast these long, distorted shadows, and my footsteps echoed so much that it felt like someone was walking right behind me. I kept telling myself to calm down. It was just a quiet night. But then I noticed this car, a beat-up sedan, blue or maybe gray, parked just 2 spots away from mine. I swear it hadn't been there earlier. I unlocked my car with a click, trying not to look around too much. But as I reached for the door, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. A man had gotten out of the sedan. He wasn't doing anything at first, just standing there. Then, as I slid into my seat, he started walking slowly in my direction. My stomach dropped. There was nothing normal about the way he moved. Too casual, like he was trying not to look suspicious but failing miserably. I locked my doors so fast my thumb slipped on the button. I remember fumbling to start the car, my hands trembling. That's when I saw him change direction, heading back to his car. I thought maybe I was overreacting. Maybe he just forgot something. I started to feel a bit silly for freaking out. Maybe he was just another late worker or someone waiting for a friend. But as I backed out of my spot, I noticed his sedan's headlights flick on. My gut twisted. He was following me. At first, I tried convincing myself it was just a coincidence. We were both heading out at the same time, right? But when I turned left out of the lot, he turned left. When I made an early, awkward right onto a side street, his car did too. By then, my hands were gripping the wheel so tightly that my knuckles ached. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, praying he'd veer off onto another road. He didn't. That's when I started panicking. My car wasn't exactly built for speed, and this guy seemed determined to stay right on my tail. I turned again, this time onto a street I didn't even recognize. The houses here were dark, barely lit by the glow of their porch lights. I hoped maybe I could lose him in the neighborhood maze, but no matter how many sharp turns I made, his headlights stayed in my rearview mirror. I could feel my chest tightening as I tried to figure out what to do. Should I stop and confront him? Should I call someone? My phone was buried in my bag, and digging for it felt impossible while driving. My brain was racing, trying to remember everything I'd ever read about getting away from someone following you. I decided to head toward a busier area, hoping more people and traffic would scare him off. I managed to find my way back to a main road, the streetlights and passing cars making me feel slightly safer. But he didn't back off, not even for a second. His car was still right there, trailing just far enough to avoid suspicion from anyone else, but close enough that I couldn't ignore him. I could see his face now in my mirror. He had this blank, almost bored expression that made my skin crawl. I started switching lanes erratically, hoping to confuse him or at least make it harder to stay behind me, but he copied every move. My heart felt like it was about to explode out of my chest when I spotted a gas station up ahead. It was brightly lit, with a few cars parked in front. I made a snap decision to pull in, thinking I could lose him there. As I turned into the lot, I felt a wave of relief, but it didn't last long. Instead of driving past like a normal person, he pulled in right after me. My hands were shaking so bad I barely managed to park the car. I didn't know what to do. My whole body was screaming at me to get out and run, but where would I even go? The gas station wasn't one of those big convenience store types. Just a couple of pumps and a small attendance booth with thick glass. I glanced at the booth, hoping the worker would notice me, but the guy inside looked absorbed in his phone. Meanwhile, the man from the sedan had parked a few spaces away. He didn't get out of his car. He just sat there, staring at me. I could feel his eyes, cold and invasive, even from a distance. My mouth went dry as I realized I couldn't just sit there forever. I decided to make it look like I wasn't scared, like I was just stopping for gas. I reached for the handle of my car door, but when I looked back at him, he moved. Slowly, he leaned out of his car window, one arm resting on the frame. It wasn't what he did that terrified me, it was the way he did it. Like he had all the time in the world, like he was enjoying my fear. His head tilted slightly, as if he were sizing me up. My instincts screamed at me not to get out of the car. I stayed frozen in my seat, clutching the steering wheel like it would somehow shield me. My breathing was shallow, and I could hear my own heartbeat pounding in my ears. Then, out of nowhere, he smiled. Not a friendly smile. This was something else entirely. It was slow, deliberate, like he knew exactly how much power he had over me in that moment. My stomach turned, and I knew I couldn't stay there. I started my car back up, my hands slick with sweat, and pulled out of the parking space. His smile didn't fade as I drove past him. He just watched me, his head following my car as I left. I thought maybe that would be it. Maybe he was just trying to scare me. But as soon as I turned onto the road again, his headlights appeared in my mirror. My heart dropped. He was still following me. By this point, I wasn't even trying to hide my panic. I was driving faster than I probably should have, taking turns at random, desperately hoping to shake him. At one point, I thought I lost him after a sharp turn onto a side street, but within seconds, those same headlights reappeared, closer than before. It was like he knew every move I was going to make. I was out of options. My brain was screaming at me to do something, anything to get away. Then I remembered a trick I'd heard somewhere. Drive to a police station. I didn't know exactly where one was, but I figured I could at least head toward the town center and hope for some kind of help. My GPS was still buried in my bag, so I had no choice but to keep driving aimlessly, praying I'd stumble across a sign or marker. I kept glancing at the rearview mirror, his car still trailing me, never getting too close but making it clear he wasn't giving up. Finally, I saw it, a small police substation, the blue and white sign glowing faintly in the night. It wasn't big, but it was enough. I sped into the parking lot, slamming the brakes as I pulled into a spot near the front door. For a moment, I thought he'd follow me in, but his car slowed to a crawl just outside the lot. I could see him clearly now, his face still wearing that same unsettling smile. He lingered there for what felt like an eternity before slowly driving away, his taillights disappearing into the night. I sat there in the police station parking lot, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly I could barely feel my fingers. I didn't want to get out. What if he came back? What if he was just waiting somewhere nearby, watching me? My chest was heaving, and I realized I hadn't been breathing properly for what felt like minutes. After a while, I forced myself to grab my bag and head inside. The station was nearly empty, just one officer at the front desk, looking half asleep. I stumbled up to the counter, trying to explain what had happened, but the words came out jumbled, like I wasn't sure if I was overreacting or if I was in real danger. The officer listened, but I could tell he wasn't taking me seriously. He asked if I got the guy's license plate or if I could describe him in detail. I could barely remember anything beyond that twisted smile and the old sedan. After a few minutes of going back and forth, he said they'd make a note of it, but that there wasn't much they could do. I left the station feeling deflated, but at least I felt safe enough to drive home. I didn't see the sedan again that night, but the whole thing has stuck with me. Every time I get in my car now, I can't help but check the mirrors, half expecting to see those headlights. It's like he's still out there, waiting. Urban exploration gone wrong. Back in the summer of 2018, I was deep into urban exploration photography. My name's Matt, and at the time, I was juggling a part-time job at a coffee shop with my growing obsession for capturing abandoned places. There was something magnetic about these crumbling buildings, silent, eerie monuments of a time long gone. That August, I came across an old factory on the edge of town. It was massive, with vines crawling up the cracked walls and broken windows reflecting the amber light of dusk. The place had been abandoned for decades, a relic of the town's industrial heyday. Rumors floated around about it being haunted or used by sketchy types, but I brushed them off. I'd explored enough derelict places to know that most of the time, the only thing you had to fear was a rusty nail or collapsing floorboards. I decided to head there alone on a Sunday afternoon. The air was sticky, and a faint storm smell lingered, though the sky was clear. I packed my usual gear, my camera, a flashlight, and a bottle of water. The factory was surrounded by a chain-link fence that was half collapsed, and getting in was easy. I just squeezed through a gap near the entrance. The inside was even more spectacular than I'd hoped. Massive steel beams arched overhead, and the ground was littered with rusting machinery and scraps of old paperwork. Every step echoed, the sound bouncing off the walls like whispers. The first floor was uneventful, just eerie silence and shafts of light cutting through the grime-covered windows. But as I climbed a set of metal stairs, the hair on the back of my neck prickled. It wasn't anything obvious, just a faint sense that the silence wasn't quite as empty as it seemed. The second floor was darker, the windows boarded up in places, leaving only thin slits of light to guide me. I clicked on my flashlight and swept the beam across the room. Most of the floor was covered in dust and debris, broken desks, scattered tools, and what looked like old worker lockers. The smell was different up here, too, like damp concrete mixed with something sharp and metallic. As I moved deeper into the space, the feeling of being watched crept over me. I told myself it was just my imagination. It always happened in these places. But then I saw something that made me stop dead. In one corner of the room, surrounded by piles of garbage and shredded fabric, there was a crude setup of what looked like a living space. A stained mattress, empty cans of food, and a bundle of ratty blankets were scattered around. My flashlight caught the glint of something shiny, a knife lying on top of the mattress. My stomach turned. I'd run into signs of squatters before, but this felt different. There was something unnervingly deliberate about the setup, like it wasn't just someone crashing for the night, but a place they guarded. I instinctively stepped back, trying to make as little noise as possible, when I heard it. A faint shuffling sound coming from the far end of the room, just beyond the range of my flashlight. I froze, barely daring to breathe. The shuffling grew louder, deliberate, as if someone was moving toward me. I swung my flashlight in the direction of the noise, and for a split second, I saw them, two figures hunched low, their faces obscured by shadows. My stomach dropped. I don't know what I expected. Maybe some kind of explanation or a gruff, "What are you doing here?" But they didn't say a word. Instead, one of them bolted forward, and I knew then and there that I had to run. I spun on my heel, almost tripping over a rusty pipe as I scrambled back toward the staircase. The pounding of my footsteps echoed through the factory, but worse, I could hear theirs too. They were chasing me. My heart was in my throat as I hit the metal stairs, each step reverberating like a scream. The thought of falling crossed my mind. I'd seen how brittle these old structures could be, but I didn't care. I had to get out. By the time I reached the first floor, the light from the broken windows felt like salvation. But my relief was short-lived. As I darted for the gap in the fence, I caught movement from the corner of my eye. Another figure stepped out from behind a stack of old crates, blocking my path. I skidded to a halt, my breath coming in ragged gasps. The figure by the crates was tall and wiry, dressed in a tattered jacket with a hood pulled low over their face. They didn't move at first, just stood there, blocking the only clear way out. Behind me, I could hear the other two closing in, their footsteps crunching on broken glass and debris. My mind raced. Should I try to reason with them? Would they listen, or was this about to take an even darker turn? "Look, I don't want any trouble," I shouted, my voice trembling. "I'm just a photographer, okay? I'll leave." My words echoed hollowly in the vast space, but the hooded figure didn't respond. Instead, they took a slow step toward me, and that's when I noticed what they were holding. A long metal rod, rusted but sturdy looking. Panic surged through me. I glanced back at the stairs and saw the other two figures emerge from the shadows. There was no way I could outrun them now. Desperation took over. I tightened my grip on my flashlight and scanned the room for another exit. There, a hole in the far wall, partially hidden behind a collapsed shelf. It wasn't much, but it was my only shot. I didn't think, I just moved. Sprinting toward the hole in the wall, I weaved around the debris as fast as my legs would carry me. Behind me, the sound of pursuit intensified. Someone yelled, a guttural noise that sent a chill straight down my spine. My flashlight beam bounced wildly, illuminating glimpses of the collapsed shelf, broken beams, and jagged edges of the hole. As I reached it, I dropped to my knees, squeezing through the narrow opening. The rough edges scraped my arms, and I could feel my shirt snagging, but I didn't stop. On the other side was a narrow alley that ran along the side of the factory. It was overgrown with weeds and littered with broken glass, but it felt like freedom. I scrambled to my feet and kept running, not daring to look back. My lungs burned, and every muscle in my legs screamed, but I pushed through the pain. Somewhere behind me, I heard shouting, but it was growing fainter. When I finally reached the main road, I collapsed onto the sidewalk, gasping for air. A car sped by, and for the first time in what felt like hours, I realized I wasn't alone anymore. I sat on the sidewalk, trembling as I tried to catch my breath. My hands were shaking so badly that I could barely hold onto my flashlight. I glanced back toward the factory, half expecting to see those figures standing at the edge of the alley, watching me. But the space was empty, eerily still. The faint sounds of traffic and a dog barking in the distance reminded me that I was back in the real world, away from whatever the hell I had just stumbled into. Yet, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. I forced myself to get up and start walking, sticking close to the streetlights as I headed back toward my car. The factory loomed behind me, its jagged silhouette visible even from blocks away. My mind raced, replaying everything that had happened. Who were they? Why had they chased me like that? Were they just trying to scare me off, or was it something worse? When I finally reached my car, I locked the doors and sat there for a long time, staring at the steering wheel. I thought about calling the police, but what would I say? That I broke into an abandoned building and ran into some squatters? It didn't seem like something they'd take seriously. That night, I couldn't sleep. Every time I closed my eyes, I saw the shadowy figures in the factory, heard the sound of their footsteps closing in on me. I kept replaying the moment I found their makeshift camp, the gleam of that knife on the mattress. What if I hadn't noticed the movement? What if I hadn't found that hole in the wall? The questions gnawed at me, making it impossible to relax. By the next morning, I was exhausted but determined to put the whole ordeal behind me. For weeks, I avoided editing the photos I had taken at the factory. Just opening the folder on my computer made my chest tighten. But eventually, curiosity got the better of me. I sifted through the shots, each one revealing the haunting beauty of the place. The broken machinery, the peeling paint, the shafts of light cutting through the darkness. Then I froze. In one of the last photos, taken just before I climbed the stairs, there was a figure in the background. They were barely visible, lurking in the shadows near the edge of the frame. My stomach dropped. I hadn't seen them at the time. They must have been watching me from the very beginning. Seeing that figure in the photo brought everything rushing back. The chase, the fear, the overwhelming sense that I had stumbled into something I wasn't supposed to see. I shut my laptop and tried to convince myself it didn't matter. They hadn't followed me, and I was safe now. But knowing they'd been there the whole time, silently watching me, made my skin crawl. I deleted the photo. In fact, I deleted the entire batch from that day. No shot was worth the reminder of what could have happened. I haven't gone back to urban exploring since. The idea of stepping into another abandoned building sends a wave of nausea through me. Every so often, I think about that factory, though. Was that group still living there? Were they dangerous, or had I just been in the wrong place at the wrong time? I'll probably never know. What I do know is that I got lucky. Lucky to escape. Lucky to walk away with only a story to tell. And sometimes, late at night, I wonder, what would have happened if I hadn't noticed that first shuffling sound? The dorm intruder. I don't even know how to start this because it still feels unreal, like I must have imagined half of it. This happened a few months ago, during my second semester of college. I had just transferred to a new school, and while I was still figuring things out, I'd lucked out with a decent single dorm room. It wasn't fancy, just a small box with ugly carpet, a twin bed, and a desk shoved against the wall, but I liked having my own space. My room was on the third floor, at the end of a long hallway, which made it quieter compared to the rest of the dorm. I liked that too, or at least I thought I did. The weirdness started one Thursday night. I'd been up late cramming for an exam, so the dorm was mostly quiet, except for the occasional footsteps echoing down the hall. I remember locking my door around midnight before crawling into bed, exhausted. I'd barely closed my eyes when I heard the sound, soft, deliberate rattling at my doorknob. At first, I thought it might be one of my neighbors drunk or confused about which room was theirs. But it didn't stop. The knob jiggled, harder this time, like whoever it was really testing if they could get in. My stomach dropped. I wanted to yell out, but my voice felt stuck in my throat. Instead, I just sat there in the dark, clutching my blanket and praying they'd go away. Eventually, the rattling stopped. I waited, barely breathing, for what felt like forever before I heard faint footsteps retreating down the hall. My heart was pounding so hard I thought it might burst. I told myself it was probably just some idiot messing around, but I couldn't shake how intentional it sounded. I stayed awake for hours, listening for any other noises, but nothing else happened that night. The next morning, I convinced myself I'd overreacted. People did dumb stuff in dorms all the time, right? I even laughed about it with a friend, calling it my creepy late-night visitor. Still, I made sure to double-check my door lock before leaving for class. That night, though, it happened again. This time, it was worse. I was lying in bed scrolling through my phone when I heard it, the doorknob jiggling, slow and deliberate, like before. But then came something new, a faint scraping sound, like a key or maybe a knife being dragged against the metal. My entire body tensed. I didn't move a muscle, just stared at the door, expecting it to burst open at any second. I thought about calling campus security, but my phone was on my desk, and there was no way I was getting out of bed to grab it. The rattling went on for what felt like forever before stopping again. The next morning, I couldn't shake the feeling that something wasn't right. I checked the outside of my door on my way to class, trying to look casual in case anyone was watching. That's when I saw it. A small piece of paper, folded up and tucked into the crack between the door frame and the wall. My stomach turned as I unfolded it. The note was handwritten in shaky, almost childlike letters. It just said, "Why won't you let me in?" I stared at it for what felt like forever, trying to convince myself it was a prank. But who would go through that much effort? And why my door? I brought the note to the RA, hoping they'd say it was just some stupid joke. But they didn't seem all that concerned. Probably someone pulling an all-nighter and getting weird, they said with a shrug. They promised to keep an eye out and suggested I file a report with campus security if I was really worried. I felt embarrassed, like I was overreacting, but I couldn't ignore how unsettled I was. That night, I pushed my desk chair under the doorknob before going to bed. It wasn't much, but it made me feel a little safer. That night, I was on edge, listening to every little sound. I kept telling myself it was just someone playing a prank or maybe some drunk idiot from another floor. Around 2 a.m., I was almost asleep when I heard it again, the doorknob jiggling. This time, it wasn't just a couple of quick shakes. It was slow, rhythmic, like whoever was on the other side wanted me to know they were there. My heart felt like it was in my throat. I stared at the door, paralyzed, my mind racing with what to do. And then I heard something new, a low, muffled voice. I couldn't make out the words, but it sounded like they were talking directly to the door. I wanted to scream or grab my phone, but I was frozen. The voice stopped, and then there was silence. Just when I thought it was over, a loud bang echoed through the room, the sound of something hitting the door hard. I jumped out of bed, adrenaline coursing through me, and grabbed my phone to call campus security. But by the time I worked up the courage to speak, the hall outside was completely silent again. When they finally showed up and checked the hallway, there was no one there. The next morning, I felt like a zombie. I barely slept and couldn't stop replaying everything in my head. I almost convinced myself I'd imagined the banging, that maybe I was just overtired. But when I opened my door to leave for class, I saw something that made my stomach drop. There was another note, taped right in the middle of my door this time. The same messy handwriting as before, but this one just said, "I don't like locked doors." My hands were shaking as I ripped it down. This wasn't a prank. Someone was targeting me specifically. I skipped my classes and went straight to campus security. They took the note, asked a bunch of questions, and said they'd increase patrols around my building. I could tell they didn't think it was a big deal, though. They kept saying things like, "It's probably someone messing around," or "This kind of thing happens in dorms." But their indifference just made me feel worse. That night, I barricaded my door with everything I could find. My desk, my chair, even a stack of textbooks. It made me feel a little safer, but not much. That night was quiet. Too quiet. I lay in bed, staring at the ceiling, every creak and groan of the building making my nerves spike. Around 3 a.m., I finally started to drift off when a loud clink jolted me awake. It wasn't the doorknob this time. It sounded like something tapping against my window. My heart sank. I was on the 3rd floor. There was no fire escape, no ledge wide enough for someone to stand on. Slowly, I turned my head toward the window, and my breath caught in my throat. There was a shadow, a figure standing just outside the glass. I couldn't see their face, but they were tall, and their outline was unmistakable. My stomach twisted as they raised a hand and tapped on the window again, the sound sharp and deliberate. I wanted to scream, but no sound came out. I didn't dare move. I just lay there, paralyzed, as the figure leaned closer, their head tilting as if trying to peer inside. And then, just as suddenly as they appeared, they were gone. I stayed frozen in my bed for what felt like hours, afraid to even blink. I kept telling myself it wasn't possible. There was no way someone could have been outside my window. I must have imagined it. But when the sun came up, I forced myself to check. My hands were shaking as I peeled back the curtain, and that's when I saw it. A faint smudge like a handprint, right in the middle of the glass. My stomach churned. There was no explaining that away. Someone had been there. I reported everything to campus security again, but it was like talking to a wall. They said they checked the grounds and found no signs of anyone trying to climb the building. It's probably nothing, they said. Could have been condensation or dirt. But I knew better. I could feel it. Whoever was doing this wasn't just messing with me anymore. That night, I couldn't bring myself to sleep in my room. I crashed on a friend's floor instead, but even then, I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. The following night, I decided to stay in my room, partly because I didn't want to keep imposing on my friends, and partly because I thought maybe it was all over. I left the curtains closed, the desk still barricading the door, and every light in the room turned on. It was almost comforting, until I noticed something strange. Around midnight, the lights started flickering, not all at once, but one by one, like something was pulling power from them. My heart was pounding as I grabbed my phone and started recording, thinking I'd show it to campus security as proof. Then I heard it, a low scraping noise, coming from the other side of the room. My stomach dropped. It wasn't the door this time, or even the window. It was the closet. The scraping sound was slow and deliberate, like someone dragging something sharp along the inside of the door. My breath caught as the doorknob on the closet gave a faint, almost hesitant click. I wanted to move, to get out of the room, but I was rooted to the spot, gripping my phone like it could somehow protect me. I don't know how long I sat there, staring at the closet door. The scraping had stopped, but the room felt unbearably silent, like the air itself had thickened. My brain kept telling me to run, but I couldn't make my body move. Finally, I worked up the nerve to grab my phone and turn on the flashlight. The beam wobbled as my hand shook, but I aimed it straight at the closet. The door was slightly ajar, just enough to show a sliver of darkness. I forced myself to stand up, every step toward the closet feeling like my legs might give out. My hand reached out, trembling, to push the door open. When I did, I expected to see something. Someone hiding inside. But there was nothing. Just my clothes hanging neatly, exactly how I'd left them. I let out a shaky breath, laughing nervously at how paranoid I'd gotten. But as I turned to step back, something caught my eye. There was a word, scratched into the back wall of the closet, barely visible in the dim light. It said, "Almost." I slammed the closet door shut and backed away, my heart hammering in my chest. That word, "almost," felt like a taunt, like whoever was doing this wanted me to know how close they'd been. I didn't sleep at all that night. I just sat on my bed, clutching my phone and staring at the closet, waiting for something else to happen. When morning finally came, I threw on my shoes and practically ran to the housing office, demanding to be moved to a different dorm. To my surprise, they didn't argue. They said someone else had recently moved out of the building under similar circumstances. That sent chills down my spine. I pressed them for details, but they got cagey and said they couldn't discuss it. All they would tell me was that I could move immediately. I didn't even go back to pack my stuff alone. I dragged a friend with me and refused to stay in that room another night. After I moved, things quieted down, but I couldn't shake the feeling that I was being watched. For weeks, I avoided walking past my old dorm building, and anytime I thought about what had happened, I felt sick to my stomach. I never found out who was behind it, or how they'd managed to leave those notes and scratches without getting caught. Campus security claimed they never saw anything suspicious on the cameras, which only made it worse. Even now, I still think about that last note in the closet. Almost. Almost what? Were they planning to get inside? Were they waiting for me to let my guard down? I'll never know, and that's what scares me the most. I try to convince myself it's over, but some nights, when it's quiet and I'm alone, I swear I can still hear that faint rattling at the door. The gas station encounter. I don't know why I even stopped there that night. The gas tank wasn't empty, and I could have made it to the next station. But it was late, close to midnight, and I was in the middle of nowhere. The highway stretched out dark and endless, with no other cars in sight. When I saw the flickering neon sign of the gas station, I figured it was better to top off than risk running out later. The place looked old, like it hadn't been updated since the 80s. A single pump stood under a dim light that buzzed like an angry wasp. Inside, I could see a lone clerk, his silhouette hunched over the counter. Something about it felt off, but I shook it off. I told myself I was just tired. When I walked in, the air felt thick, almost oppressive. The clerk barely looked up as I grabbed a bottle of water and approached the counter. His face was pale, his eyes darting to the front door every few seconds. When he finally spoke, it was barely above a whisper. "You shouldn't stay here long," he said, not meeting my eyes. I laughed nervously, thinking it was some kind of joke, but his expression didn't change. He rang up my items quickly, his hands trembling. Before I could ask what he meant, he slid my change across the counter and said, "Pump your gas and leave. If you see them, don't stop. Don't look back." My stomach dropped. I wanted to ask who them was, but the words caught in my throat. I stepped outside, the clerk's warning still replaying in my mind. The night felt heavier now, like the darkness was pressing in from all sides. As I started pumping gas, I kept glancing around, feeling like someone, or something, was watching me. The highway was still empty, and the only sound was the faint hum of the pump and the occasional rustle of wind through the trees behind the station. Then I heard it, a low, guttural sound, almost like a growl, coming from somewhere in the shadows. I froze, my hand gripping the nozzle, my heart pounding so loud I could hear it in my ears. I turned toward the sound, but all I could see was darkness. Still, I couldn't shake the feeling that something was out there. I finished pumping as fast as I could and got back into the car, locking the doors immediately. The clerk was no longer visible through the window, which only added to my unease. As I started the engine, my headlights swept across the empty lot and the edge of the woods. That's when I saw them, two figures standing just beyond the tree line. They weren't moving, just standing there, side by side, their outlines barely distinguishable. My stomach dropped, and every instinct told me to leave. But I couldn't help myself. I stared, trying to make out what I was looking at. They were tall, too tall, and their limbs seemed wrong, like they were slightly too long for their bodies. One of them tilted its head slowly, as if it was aware I was watching. That was all I needed. I floored the gas pedal and sped back onto the highway. The road felt endless as I drove, my hands gripping the wheel so tightly my knuckles turned white. I kept glancing in the rearview mirror, half expecting to see those figures chasing after me. The highway was still empty, but it didn't feel like I was alone. My chest tightened with every mile. The memory of those distorted shapes burned into my mind. I told myself they couldn't follow me, that I was safe in the car. But then, I noticed something that made my blood run cold. The dark outline of a figure appeared in my mirror, standing in the middle of the road, right where I'd just driven past. I couldn't make out any details, but it looked exactly like one of the things I'd seen at the gas station. I wanted to believe I was imagining things, but the farther I drove, the worse it got. The same figure kept appearing in my mirror, standing in the road, always at the edge of my taillights. At one point, I swore I saw two of them, and then three. I didn't see how they could possibly be keeping up with me, but they were there, always the same distance behind, like shadows refusing to let go. I turned the radio on, hoping to drown out my rising panic, but all I got was static. It wasn't normal static either. It was broken up by sharp, irregular bursts, almost like whispers. I hit every button on the console, trying to make it stop, but the sound just grew louder, crackling and hissing until it felt like it was coming from inside my own head. I couldn't take it anymore. My hands were shaking so badly I could barely keep the car steady, and my heart felt like it was going to burst out of my chest. I slammed on the brakes, skidding to a stop on the shoulder of the road. The highway was still deserted, silent except for the faint sound of my engine ticking. I threw the car into park and looked behind me, half expecting to see those figures standing there. But the road was empty. Nothing but darkness stretched out in both directions. For a moment, I thought maybe it was over, that I had outrun whatever was happening. But then, out of the corner of my eye, I saw movement. There, in the trees lining the side of the road, something was shifting. I could barely make it out, but it was there, just inside the tree line. The figures weren't standing still anymore. They were moving, their shapes weaving in and out of the shadows like they were gliding, not walking. Their limbs looked even more unnatural up close, bending at angles that shouldn't be possible. I sat frozen in my seat, too terrified to move, until one of them stepped into the light. It wasn't human. Its face was pale and featureless, almost like a blank mask, and its body seemed to flicker, like it wasn't entirely there. It tilted its head again, just like before, and I swear I heard something. A soft, raspy sound, almost like breathing, coming from everywhere and nowhere at once. My fight or flight instincts finally kicked in, and I chose flight. I slammed the car into gear and sped off, the tires screeching against the asphalt. My heart was pounding so hard it felt like it would crack my ribs. As the car surged forward, I kept glancing at the side mirrors, desperate to see if they were still following. At first, there was nothing but the dark, empty road. I let out a shaky breath, thinking I'd left them behind. But then, in the distance, I saw it, one of those figures standing dead center in the road ahead. It wasn't moving, just standing there, waiting. I panicked and swerved, the tires skidding as I narrowly avoided hitting it. For a split second, as my headlights passed over it, I saw that same pale, featureless face staring back at me. My car fishtailed, and I almost lost control, but I managed to stay on the road. I didn't dare look back this time. I just drove faster, the speedometer climbing past 90. The road ahead blurred as tears filled my eyes, but I refused to stop. I couldn't stop. I had this overwhelming feeling that if I slowed down, even for a second, they'd catch me, and I didn't want to know what would happen if they did. I drove for what felt like hours, even though I know it couldn't have been more than 15 or 20 minutes. The highway remained empty, no signs of life, no other cars, just that endless stretch of road cutting through the dark. The whispers on the radio were gone now, but the silence felt worse. It was heavy, suffocating, like the world had emptied out and left me completely alone. But I wasn't alone. I could feel it like a pressure in the air, the unmistakable sense that something was still there, watching. The hairs on the back of my neck stood on end, and every instinct told me not to look in the mirrors. But I couldn't help it. My eyes darted up to the rear-view mirror, and my stomach dropped. They were there again, but this time they were closer. So close I could see their outlines clearly in the faint glow of my taillights. There were more of them now, at least 5 or 6, their twisted shapes moving in that same unnatural gliding motion. My foot pressed harder on the gas, but no matter how fast I went, the distance between us never seemed to grow. It was like they weren't bound by the same rules, like they weren't really real. I started muttering to myself, a mix of prayers and panicked swearing, anything to keep myself grounded. But deep down, I was starting to realize there might not be a way out of this. Then, out of nowhere, I saw lights ahead, a pair of glowing yellowish beams cutting through the darkness. It was another car. Relief hit me like a wave, and for a moment, I thought I might actually be safe. I honked my horn and flashed my high beams, desperate to get their attention. The car slowed as it approached, pulling off to the side of the road. I skidded to a stop just behind it, fumbling with my seatbelt as I prepared to jump out and beg for help. But as I reached for the door handle, I froze. The lights from the other car illuminated the road, and in that glow, I saw them again. They weren't in the distance anymore. They were closer than ever, standing just behind my car. There were so many of them now, too many to count, their pale, flickering forms closing in from all sides. The figure closest to me tilted its head again, and for the first time, it moved with purpose, stepping toward the driver's side window. Its face, or whatever it had instead of a face, was inches away, and I swear I could feel it watching me, even though it had no eyes. My breath caught in my throat, and I couldn't move. I couldn't even scream. I don't know what snapped me out of it, maybe the adrenaline or pure survival instinct, but I threw the car into reverse without thinking. The engine roared as I sped backward, narrowly missing the other car. The figures didn't flinch. They just stood there, completely still, as if they were waiting for something. My tires screeched as I swerved back onto the road, slamming the gear into drive and flooring the gas pedal. I didn't care where I was going anymore. I just needed to get away. My headlights lit up the empty road ahead, but I couldn't shake the feeling that they were still there, just out of sight, waiting. As I sped down the highway, something strange happened. The air around me felt lighter, like whatever oppressive force had been suffocating me was starting to lift. The darkness seemed less consuming, and I could see the faint glow of city lights in the distance. For the first time that night, I felt a glimmer of hope. But just as I started to believe I was safe, my car radio crackled to life. That same static, broken up by sharp, unnatural bursts, filled the cabin. And then, through the noise, I heard it, a voice. It wasn't a whisper this time. It was low, distorted, and almost mocking. "You can't outrun us," it said. My blood ran cold, and I slammed my fist against the radio, but the voice only grew louder. I was losing it. My hands were shaking so hard I could barely keep the wheel straight, and the voice on the radio kept repeating those same words, over and over. "You can't outrun us." I tried turning the radio off, but the knob wouldn't budge. The voice was coming from everywhere now, echoing in my head. My vision blurred with tears, and I gripped the wheel tighter, forcing myself to keep driving toward the faint glow of the city. The road ahead seemed endless, and no matter how fast I went, it felt like I wasn't getting any closer. My chest was so tight I could hardly breathe, but I couldn't stop. I didn't dare stop. Then, as suddenly as it had started, the radio went silent. The road stretched out empty and quiet in front of me, and the oppressive feeling I'd carried for miles seemed to vanish. My breathing slowed, and I risked a glance in the rearview mirror. Nothing. The figures were gone. I almost laughed in relief, though it came out more like a sob. The city lights were clearer now, and I could make out the faint outlines of buildings. It was over, or so I thought. Just as I crossed the threshold into town, I saw it. A single figure, standing under a flickering streetlight at the edge of the road. Its head tilted in that same unnerving way, as if it knew I was watching. I didn't stop. I didn't even slow down. I just drove until I was surrounded by the safety of city lights. By the time I finally pulled into a crowded gas station on the edge of town, my entire body was trembling. I parked near the entrance, where the bright fluorescent lights and steady flow of people made me feel like I'd finally escaped whatever had been chasing me. I sat there for a long time, gripping the steering wheel, trying to convince myself that I was safe now. But no matter how much I tried to shake it, the image of those figures stayed with me. Their distorted shapes, their impossible movements, that blank, tilting stare. I eventually went inside to get some water, hoping the normalcy of the bustling store would help me calm down. The clerk gave me a strange look as I stumbled to the counter, probably because I looked like I'd been through hell. I paid in silence and stepped back outside, taking deep breaths to steady myself. But as I stood there, I couldn't help but glance back at the highway I'd just come from. It was far in the distance now, but I could still see it stretching into the darkness. For a moment, I swore I saw movement. something flickering just at the edge of the light. I blinked, and it was gone. I've never driven that stretch of highway again, and I've never stopped at another remote gas station at night. Whatever I saw that night, I know it wasn't human. I can't explain what happened, and I'm not sure I want to. All I know is, sometimes, when I'm driving alone at night, I still catch myself checking the rearview mirror, half expecting to see them again. So far, I haven't. But I don't think they're gone. Not really.